So, Ben, we have some breaking news to open our video with at time of recording. There's some Starfleet news, which feels unusual, but I thought we would start with this. Um, what's been announced again yesterday at time of recording?
Yeah, time of recording yesterday, some very exciting news at a massive re-release of Brian May's The Starfleet Project, which is a bit of an oddity in Starfleet history.
Yeah.
So, do you want me to go ahead and go into the intricate details
Oh,
of
I
what
yes,
happened,
I
or you
would.
want kind of a bird's eye overview?
Let's do a bird's eye overview for just for the folks who are kind of new to Starfleet, but they might have. I feel
Right.
like if you've heard of Starfleet, you've heard of this
Yes, this
release, but
this strange
it is an
phenomenon.
oddity. Yeah, yeah,
So, when Starfleet was being broadcast in the UK, Brian May, who's famous for being the guitarist for a band called Queen, kind of a smaller band. You've probably never heard of Queen. Bohemian Rhapsody, a little indie single. Yeah, anyway. So Brian put out a record called The Starfleet Project in '83, shortly after Starfleet had done its first run in the UK. And he's just announced that he's re releasing it and remastering it in a really big, fancy box set
hmm
uh, as well as a remastered CD, and it's just broken out, and some of the official exclusive versions on Queen's website have already sold out.
wow,
So those sold out within 24 hours. So you won't be getting them most
yeah,
likely, but there's still a lot of cool stuff and swag for
nice,
Starfleet fans and for Queen fans as well,
yeah,
and Van
that
Halen fans as well, which we can
right,
get in later.
yeah. I mean, it's such a bizarre. It's not the news I was expecting to see. And I only know about this as we'll go into later as a kind of I only know about Starfleet kind of as a spectator, I suppose. So I don't
Right.
know a huge amount about it. But when I saw that news, I was like, that's cool. Because I love the single. I
Yes.
just before we started chatting, I listened to the single. I was like, oh yeah, this is good stuff. This is
Did you
excellent.
listen to the remastered
Yeah,
version?
yeah, yeah.
Oh, it sounds way better
It sounds
than it had
phenomenal. Yeah,
previously.
yeah, it's really good. So yeah. Anyway, so I wanted to open with that.
Yes. It's
It's a
very exciting news. It's going to be a great addition to Starfleet fans' record collections, and for
yeah,
people who are in that niche, in
yeah.
the Venn diagram of like Queen fans, Van Halen fans, and Starfleet fans. If you're
I'm
in that
get
Venn diagram, this is the
yeah.
moment for you.
I'm guessing that there are going to be a lot of Queen fans who like. I've never actually watched the show. I'm assuming. I'm just
Yeah, yeah.
guessing.
I'm
But
sure
yeah,
there's quite a few people who
yeah. But that's
and
good.
quite a
That's
few.
actually an exciting opportunity for it to possibly bleed through into a whole new generation of fans. So
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
exciting. Yeah, yeah. Yes, so hello, welcome to another Security Hazard video. This is Jack Knoll here, and I am joined by Mr. Ben Page. Hello, sir. How are
Oh,
you
hi.
today?
I'm good. How are you, Jack?
I am doing very, very well. Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are very, very welcome here.
Oh, thank you.
Um,
It's an honor to be here.
so people might be a little bit confused about the subject of this video. We're talking about Starfleet, which is not a Gerry Anderson series and therefore has
No,
no
indeed.
business being involved on the Security Hazard blog, obviously, except
Yes,
it totally does because there are some
because it's
very,
awesome.
very strong connections. And also, it is just an awesome show in its own right. But so I'm coming into this as not much of an expert on the show at all. And that's kind of why I wanted to do this video because Ben, very much, as far as I'm concerned anyway, is an expert on the show and knows it really well. So I honestly wanted to do this video just to be educated, basically, and just kind of I don't know, just kind of soak in something that I'm not so familiar with. I've literally like just this week finished watching the show all the way through for the first time. Um,
Mm.
so my first experience, I'm sure we will get into. But Ben, you're very familiar with the show, so how about you introduce yourself for everyone watching and your connections with various things, Anderson or
Yes.
otherwise.
Yes. Well, I'm Ben Page, sometimes known as Ben Wolf Page, because Wolf is my middle name. Uh, I am a puppeteer, filmmaker, podcaster, general doer of things to do with puppets in outer space. That's sort of my sweet spot in life. I
Hmm.
saw Thunderbirds when I was about 9, and around the same time I saw Star Wars, and I said, "Wow, these things are things that I want to be involved with."
Yeah.
And Starfleet is just perfect for that because it's pretty much the ultimate marriage of Thunderbirds with Star Wars aesthetic
Yeah.
fused in a very unusual way.
That's actually something
Yeah.
that really hit me on my kind of rewatch of this because
Yes.
just to so the story is basically that I think when the DVD, the 2009 DVD kind of came out,
Mhm.
I sort of started watching the show, but because it's a kind of continuous serial, I would start watching it. I'd watch a couple of episodes and then put it down, go and do something else, and then come back like months later because that's the way I watch things, and
Yeah.
realize I've kind of forgotten everything that's happened already. Go back
Yeah.
to the start again. So I've seen the first episode many times, but never made it all the way through before. But this time I
Right.
actually was able to sit down and appreciate the whole show in one go. And yeah, what really hit me this time around is, yeah, the Star Wars connection is
Mm.
very strong. I mean,
Yes.
it is that same kind of big epic space opera, um, which I would actually argue the show does a little bit better than Star Wars, actually.
Well, in
Um,
some ways.
just in terms of, I don't know, just some of the connections with the characters, I feel are just kind of a little
Mm.
bit stronger. There's a little bit more history and just kind of stuff going on
Yeah.
there that
Yeah.
I appreciate a little bit more than Star Wars. But that's just me personally. So
Sure.
I'm gonna annoy all the Star Wars fans just to
You're
start this
going
video
way
off.
out on a limb there, Jack.
Yeah. But as far as the Anderson kind of connection is concerned,
Sure. Yeah.
um, Starfleet was made with puppets in the
It was made
80s.
with puppets in the 80s in Japan,
Right.
where Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet and all the rest of the Gerry Anderson shows were very popular.
Hmm.
There was there had been kind of a tradition of super marionation style puppetry in Japan by a guy named Kinosuke Takeda,
Hmm.
who was a Japanese puppeteer filmmaker. And he made Galaxy Boy Troop, Spaceship Silica, Aerial City 008, which is kind of an obscurity. These are all
Right.
Japanese super marionation style shows that were all
Wow.
sci-fi. So
Okay.
there was kind of like this tradition of it, and it kind of died out. Aerial City 008 was around the time of UFO, so
Okay.
late 60s, early 70s.
Right.
And it kind of petered out along with the Super Marionation stuff. And as you're heading like through the Star Wars craze of the late 70s into kind of a resurgence of interest in sci-fi,
Hmm.
uh, there was a ton of anime. Anime had become huge in Japan, and so there was a lot of interest in, okay, well, how do we explore more sci-fi properties? How can we stand out from the crowd? And the way that they found to do that was to pitch this as a puppet show,
Mm.
and that's kind of how they picked it up. Obviously, there was a lot of love for Thunderbirds among the people that made it.
Yeah. So as the pit, I imagine the pitch was probably, well, it'll be Star Wars mixed with Thunderbirds. I mean, come on. What's
Yeah,
not to love?
I think that was definitely a huge part of it.
Yeah.
But there's also some stuff about the origins that's fairly new to me. That's only
Mm.
recently come to light about how it was based on a Japanese folk tale.
Okay. I can see, yeah, I
So
can see that. That makes sense to me thinking about the show. Yeah,
yeah,
that's cool.
it's a very famous story about a princess who falls from the moon to Earth, and kind of a quest of like reconnection and her finding her true identity. It's the basis for a Studio Ghibli film,
Okay.
which I can't remember the name of, or wouldn't be able to pronounce if I did. I think it's
Yes.
the tale of Princess Kaguya. I want
Okay.
to say
Okay. Fair
it's a
enough.
very
Fair enough.
famous, well-known anime feature film from about 10 years ago.
Cool.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's common source material in Japanese culture, but also bringing in these Western influences,
Hmm.
which were very popular at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I could tell there was, yes, there is a certain, like, yeah, you could feel there's kind of a folklore
Mhm.
influence in there, in the kind of, there are a lot of very common, what's the word, sort of, not trappings, but like the things you would commonly associate with
Yes,
fantasy storytelling, which I suppose Star Wars tried to do the same thing as well
yes,
with
it's very
princesses
mythic.
and heroes, and yes, it has got that kind of mythic, feeling to it. So,
Yeah, there's a
which,
lot of mythological kind of storytelling that they
yeah,
weave in.
which is kind of interesting because, again, going back to Anderson shows, I feel like
Mm,
they're a lot more kind of grounded in a way, and like
yes.
just trying to be very realistic and everything, whereas, and kind of based in a real world,
Mhm.
whereas Starfleet is prepared to kind of go a little bit more out there,
Yes,
as far as those elements are concerned. So,
very true.
um yeah, so am I right in thinking that you came to Starfleet first before you found Anderson shows? Am I right in
No,
thinking that?
no, no. So I would have seen Thunderbirds in about 2002. It was
Okay.
broadcast in America on a channel called Tech TV. And I
Hmm.
always mention that on the off chance that I wasn't the only person watching. I've never heard anybody else say that they discovered Thunderbirds this way.
Right.
So that would have been when I was about 9, and it took me a few years to kind of discover Starfleet. And I
Hmm.
did that through a really awesome website called Starfleet X Bomber, sfxb.co.uk,
Mm.
which is, I think, the template for, in those days, it was the template for all fan sites. It was kind of the
Oh,
king in terms of it really well laid out, detailed,
right.
excellent website by Andy Thomas, who's still a big part of the fandom, even though the website's pretty much stagnant these days, other
Mm.
than the forum, which is still very active.
Nice.
Uh, but yeah, so I discovered it through that website and just kind of became obsessed with how unique it is,
Yeah.
and what a unique thing. And I mean, the fusion of those two aesthetics was just perfect. Because watching Thunderbirds, I always felt like this is really great. I love this. You could do anything with this kind of storytelling,
Yeah.
which and they did. I mean, they made things like Joe 90 and the Secret Service that are so far removed from what Thunderbirds is, which is great. But it's
Yeah.
just it's also great to see somebody else come in with a totally different take and use some different techniques, and just really do a totally different approach. So yeah, when the DVDs came out in 2009, I was there waiting for them for
Right.
sure. I
Okay.
had I
That's
had been a fan
interesting.
for a few years, and the first copies that I bought, I've purchased Starfleet more times than any other media.
Wow.
I
Gosh.
bought uh, bootleg copies of the American VHS tapes on eBay,
Wow.
where the American version of the show splices together 3 episodes into a feature-length presentation, one for each tape. Uh, and it's the worst way to watch Starfleet, I
Right.
think. It's
That's
part of
funny.
the fun is like watching it for 30 minutes and then coming back later. If you
Yeah.
try to like marathon it, it doesn't work as well, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
You kind of need those cliffhangers in there. You
Yeah,
need a
and you need
little bit
some.
of time to process.
Yeah, there's a lot that happens in the episodes, as I'm finding in my blog as I write it,
Mm.
where I'm doing an episode guide of Starfleet called X Blogger. But it's just so dense, and
Mm.
also kind of. irritatingly dubbed in a lot of places where there's like awkward
well, yes.
pauses, and yeah, we'll get into that, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
as you're like wading through all this material, if you're doing it for too long, it gets a little
yeah,
uncomfortable.
yeah.
So it is a weird way to. So I was very relieved when the UK DVD finally came out and I could
That's
import
good.
those and watch them.
Yeah. So the talking about the dub, then
Yeah.
it started. It's obviously a Japanese show,
Yes. Called X
which
Bomber
called
originally.
X Bomber, and then it was dubbed into English for the UK and the US and elsewhere. Do you know like what the kind of transformation process was like, and how how different is the Japanese to the English version? I've only ever obviously seen the English version, so um
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you kind of know about how the kind of translation process and everything might have changed the show, or maybe how it might have stayed the same.
Yes. Yes. Well, so when X Bomber came out, it was originally released in Japan in 1980. So
Right.
this would have been before most people in Japan would not have seen The Empire Strikes Back yet.
Okay.
For a little bit of
Right.
context.
Yeah.
So it comes out in Japan in 1980 and just absolutely crashes and burns with the audience. It gets through about half of its run before it's canceled and it's pulled from the airwaves. There's a bunch of toys that do okay, but not really great. And
Huh.
it just kind of it had this reputation in Japan for not being that special, which I think is kind of weird.
Okay.
And it was very weird to Western audiences because Western audiences weren't used to the trappings of Japanese storytelling.
Okay.
So a lot of things that were revolutionary when the show hit the UK, which was in late 1982, the greatest geek year ever, as Mark A. Altman wrote, because so many geeky things happened in
Yeah, that's
1982.
true. Yeah.
But when it finally hit UK audiences in 1982, a lot of the stuff that was going on with it was totally revolutionary because you didn't have that many Japanese shows that had been imported. You had like Battle of the Planets, which was a
Mm.
redub of an anime called Gatchaman, which had been heavily edited and changed.
Hmm.
So you didn't have Starfleet's kind of pitch. The kind of pitch that they made with it was this is the most authentically translated uh, Japanese show ever brought to English television.
Oh,
That was part of their idea. It's like, oh,
okay.
it's authentically Japanese and authentically different,
Yeah.
which meant basically that when they bought the property from Japan to import it, they had a very very literal script
Ah.
that had just been basically just translated word for word and
Okay.
not really like
And yeah,
translated but not interpreted.
and because the languages are so different, yeah,
Yes.
I could see why that might be a problem. Yes.
And you can kind of hear it in the dialogue
A
sometimes. Some of it
little.
snuck
Yeah,
through.
yeah.
So
Certainly in the titles of some of the episodes, I feel like they're a little
yes,
bit bizarre, but although those
yes,
titles don't actually appear on screen, do they? They're just
no,
kind
no. So
of
that
on the
wouldn't have been
releases.
part of. They would have just been numbered. They wouldn't have been
Okay.
known by those titles.
That's
But
funny.
those titles are very literally translated.
Yeah. But yes, so the dialogue, so what they were provided with was just very literal. And so did they
Yes,
tidy that up in a way? You know,
yes,
how
they
did they
did. So
change it a little, or yeah, how did that go?
very interesting process. So Louis Ellman was the producer of the English version.
Okay.
A great dubbing editor of a lot of uh, programs brought over imported from
Hmm.
Japan elsewhere, and he apparently didn't have a lot of time because he reached out to a writer named Michael Sloan, who who created later something called The Equalizer. You may have
Okay.
heard of.
Right.
Michael was a very qualified TV writer, very skilled, and he called him and basically gave him just a few days to rewrite the whole show. So Michael's job was to take this
Wow.
very literal script and try to convert it to into working order in a very
Okay.
short amount of time. And I actually reached out to Michael to see if he would do an interview for the blog, and he
Hmm.
said, "Be honest, I don't really want to talk about it that much." And
I mean, if it
you,
was only a few days of work, it's probably not much
you can
to it,
kind
I
of
guess. But
understand. Yeah, it
yeah,
was a high pressure kind of situation.
yeah.
But it's still because of that kind of awkwardness that they didn't quite smooth over, it retains a lot of its literalness. So as a show, it's very similar to what X Bomber is in Japanese. So
Okay,
if you watch the X Bomber version with subtitles, which you can do on the US Blu-ray release,
okay,
um, it's a very similar kind of show. There's a
right.
few things that are different,
Isn't there
but the
like there's
basic
like
plot
one
is all the same.
extra episode in the Japanese version that's a
Yes,
clip show? I feel like I read somewhere. I mean,
yes,
there's a lot
correct.
of clip shows in this,
There are a lot of clip shows in
actually.
this, and I wonder if that was pressure that the original production team was under to
Yes,
try
because
and
budget
crank them out.
was tight and
Yes,
schedule was tight,
yes,
if I
always,
read correctly. So
always.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, really, that I guess yeah, because of that limited amount of time that Michael Sloan had to work on the scripts, there probably wasn't a lot of scope for changing anything
No,
dramatically because he didn't have the time to do it. So
yeah, it wouldn't
that's
have been
really
possible.
interesting. Um, I mean, it's great, really, that yeah, it definitely retains that there is a yes, it feels Japanese, and that's the only way I can really describe it as someone who's really not an expert on Eastern culture or media in any way, but it does feel authentically Japanese. So I guess in a way it kind of it fulfills that requirement, and that's what makes it certainly stand out from Anderson shows.
Yes.
What's funny though is thinking about, okay, what was Gerry doing at the time? So
Mm,
Terrorhawks was on the horizon. Um,
yes.
Possibly had even gone into production. I'm not entirely sure, but certainly getting ready
Yes.
to do Terrorhawks, which of course was seeking Japanese investment. So
Yes.
yeah, it's kind of interesting there the crossover between the two and how Gerry was trying to do new puppet or a different style of puppetry than what he had done before,
Right.
but Starfleet was kind of trying to go a little bit back to the Thunderbird style of puppets, but with rods rather than wires. And I wonder,
Mm.
as someone who knows about puppetry in the way that you do, how do you feel that the puppetry style of Starfleet compares to certainly the early Supermarionation shows and then Terrorhawks, and whether you have a preference as to kind of
Mm.
how it all how they all compare to each other. Because I feel
Wow.
like maybe fans look at Starfleet and go, well, it's kind of like a cross between Terrorhawks and Thunderbirds in terms of puppetry
Sure.
style, but sort of not quite. It's got its own
But also
thing
not
going
that.
on
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, I
Yeah.
wondered, like, how do you view that?
It's such an interesting thing with puppetry because a big part of how puppetry works is it fools your brain, right? And you're basically you're when you're watching a puppet show, your brain is connecting the dots between a voice acting performance and a puppetry performance. And the puppet itself is kind of like the bridge between those two things, and you just kind of imagine the life. You're just connecting those dots. And individual people imagine the connection between those dots differently. So
Mm,
I've met American puppeteers who just do not go for the Super Marionation style of puppetry at all. They're just off put by the whole look. They're like, oh, they're ugly, they don't work, they're stiff, they're unnatural. And then vice versa, there's people who are like, oh, this style of puppetry doesn't work. Oh, it's just ugly. And people are quick to throw out those words, I think, because of that. Like it's kind of like a brain training thing almost, where
right.
you see things and you get used to them, and you
Yeah.
once so if you grew up watching Thunderbirds and all the previous and subsequent Super Marionation shows, your brain kind of like adjusts to this idea of what these types of puppets and these types of shows are supposed to be. And then
Yeah.
something like Terrahawks comes along and your brain just doesn't, what? You have
I
to.
remember the first time I saw Terrorhawks was like,
Mm,
what? I mean, I thought it was fantastic, but I was like, because I'd seen promotional like stills of the characters. I had
sure.
no idea actually how these creatures moved and like how their mouths moved and
Yeah,
opened and stuff like that. So when I saw a Terrorhawks puppet open its mouth for the first time, I was like, wow. I mean, I thought, wow, what an advancement, that it felt so different. But it's like
yeah,
people just kind of lump the shows together, but it's like, no,
they
it
do.
was a different style.
Yeah,
And yeah, I feel like, at least for me, Starfleet kind of comes right kind of in the middle of that. Um,
yeah, I think that's fair to
yeah,
say. The thing with the Starfleet puppets is that they're quite beautifully sculpted.
right.
They're very, very, and I think people almost don't realize that they're so beautifully sculpted because they
Mm,
move so poorly. They have
yeah,
very poor, like, kind of jerky or swift
it's
movement.
stiff. It's a little stiff. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I mean, they have rods up their butts.
yeah.
That's literally what's going on when you're watching Starfleet. And so they have a wide array of movements that they can do. They can move
Mm,
their arms and their legs, but it's all very it's kind of the technique they used is reminiscent of like Czech or Eastern European rod puppetry,
okay.
which is the method that I'm using to make my film Astral Beacon. But it's
Mhm.
it's usually reserved for puppets that are a lot smaller, so that you
Right.
can kind of make quick movements. So
I
it's really
see.
great for doing creatures or like insects.
Yeah.
Or I've seen one of the best, the puppet master who's building my puppets for my film. His one of his signature creatures is kind of like a little hobgoblin creature that
Okay.
literally like comes to life, and it's very like sprightly and dancy. And it's basically the same type of puppet as the Starfleet puppets, but the
Right.
Starfleet puppets are Super Nation scale. They're a little larger, so they
Okay.
don't have as much. They need to be, because they're on camera and because of the way that they are, the type of story that they're telling. They
Mm,
need to be a bit more graceful than perhaps they are in terms of their
yeah.
movements. And it's
That's
a shame
interesting.
because they're so beautifully crafted.
Yeah. I mean, there are things about the way they move that I do find like quite I like the like when they run down a corridor, there is
Mm.
a certain energy to that that you
Yes.
wouldn't get from a Supermarination puppet. Just
No,
by their
no,
very
yeah.
nature, they cannot move that quickly. Whereas,
Yeah.
yeah, a Starfleet puppet will just bolt down a corridor really, really quickly, and you can kind of tell, obviously, that they're just
Yeah.
puppeteers like crashing into each other under there. But in a way, yeah, it adds it's just a different energy to it.
It
Um,
is, yeah.
that isn't there, that is sort of familiar, but yeah, slightly different. And it's interesting what you say about like your brain, if you grew up on shows like Thunderbirds, is kind of trained to be able to kind of see where the magic kind of elevates this static object into
Yeah.
something that is alive. Um, I do think you do need to have that kind
Mm.
of training, which is interesting. You talk about the differences between British and American,
Mm.
kind of, because I feel like I have noticed that there is a cultural difference there between
Absolutely.
child in the UK, puppets are everywhere growing up, or certainly they were when I was growing up, sort of in the 90s and early
Yeah.
2000s.
Yeah.
you, you do get that sense that maybe Americans weren't brought up on that same thing. But then again, I suppose you had things like Sesame Street and the Muppets and
Yeah.
things like that. So yeah, I don't
That
know.
I
It's
think that was one
interesting.
of the plagues of Jim Henson's life was
Mm,
was that he established the Muppets and kind of broke through into the mainstream with puppetry, but then it kind of got locked into this one idiom where, and
yeah.
Jim Henson wasn't really like that very much. He did a show for PBS, which is great if anybody's interested in puppetry, which if you've listened this far, you are. It's called Worlds of Puppetry, I think.
Okay.
and it's literally a mini series that he did. You can find it various places online, where he interviewed puppeteers from all over the globe and all different styles of puppetry. So he was very open to all these different styles, but people kind of became locked into this idea of
Just
puppets
focus on.
are Muppets, and it's
Yeah.
not the
Yeah.
case.
That's exactly it. That's what I definitely get that sense, at least living over here. So
Mm.
I'm a British guy living in the US. Ben is an American living in the UK, at least right now. So we often
We've
have these
swapped.
conversations about cultural differences and things like that. So
It's
yeah,
fascinating though,
it
isn't it?
is really interesting the way that those things comes about. And then we're, both trying to talk about Japanese influences
Yeah,
here with
exactly. Yeah,
Starfleet. So it's
it's a global world.
exactly it is, yeah. So coming back round to Terrorhawks and like the
Mm,
connection there between, just because I feel like what I see a lot in Anderson discourse is, oh, Starfleet is a cheap ripoff of Anderson shows, and particularly Terrorhawks because they came out around the same time.
right.
What say you to that?
Well, it's definitely a misreading of history to
Hmm.
say that, I think, because
Yeah,
the the Japanese show came out in 1980, so
right.
before Terrorhawks was really underway.
Hmm.
Um, you could argue, I suppose, so the history of Terrorhawks goes back to a concept that Jerry had with Tohoku Shinsha, which is a big
Mm,
Japanese production company, and Tohoku Shinsha kind of brought Jerry to Japan to work on an anime series that was going to be called Thunderhawks.
mm,
And Reg Hill worked on some of the concept designs, vehicle designs, and things, and it just never really gelled.
right.
There's some controversy about how exactly it fell over, the partnership between Jerry and Tohoku Shinsha.
Hmm,
But basically, they agreed to part ways
okay.
amicably enough in the end. And Jerry came back and took the concept and made Terrahawks, and Tohoku Shinsha took the concept and made a show called Thunderbirds 2086.
Ah,
So both of those shows originated from the same like
that's interesting. I
concept.
actually didn't know that that was the connection
Isn't
there.
that
I
interesting?
obviously I
Yeah.
know about Thunderbirds 2086, well, which was Techno Voyager in
Yes.
Japan. Okay, right. See, okay, now I can see
You're
how it
connecting
all
the
kind of
dots. Yeah.
comes together. Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. But so in terms of like how, so yeah, going back to like
Starfleet.
Starfleet,
Yeah, so
how,
Starfleet was created totally separate to any of that. It was produced by a different Japanese production company that didn't have any dealings with Tohoku Shinsha or Gerry Anderson,
right,
and it didn't even make its way to the UK until Terrahawks was very much funded and in production.
right,
Which I don't think, I've never heard any tellings of that being a deliberate choice.
right.
I think it's really more the result of a groundswell of interest in these kinds of things again,
I was going
because
to
you
say,
have
I think it comes more from just that was what was in at the time.
yeah. Well, and
Capitalizing
you
on
had
Star Wars' success and
yeah,
everything, basically. Um,
Star Wars was happening. Fanderson was kind of forming,
yeah,
so you saw a lot more popularity of repeats and these
mhm,
kinds of things.
yeah,
Some of the dust had settled from the Space 1999 Year Two debacle.
yeah.
You know,
People were after like something
yeah,
new and different from
yeah.
Jerry, certainly,
And Jerry
and
had never stopped trying to pitch new shows and
exactly,
concepts.
yeah,
He was
yeah,
out there
yeah.
pounding the pavement with
But
things like Five Star Five and all kinds
oh
of other
yes,
aborted
yes,
projects.
yes. Which also Star Wars. Like you just
Yes,
kind of keep that was the kind of big looming shadow over so much of what was going on at that time. Yeah,
absolutely.
it is fascinating. But you know, basically, I think that Starfleet and Terrorhawks are really different, actually, just in terms
Very
of the
different.
way they go about storytelling. The writing style is so different. As I say, Starfleet has this more kind of mythical quality, whereas in a
Mhm.
way, I mean, Terrorhawks obviously gets kind of progressively more comedic and kind of bizarre, but still quite almost kind of world weary in a way. Like I feel like a character like
Yeah.
Neinstein, who's kind of grumpy and just kind of not always like would not fit in Starfleet at all. He's just a little bit too grounded to a fault in reality, whereas
Yes.
Starfleet's a little bit more optimistic. um it's trying to seek towards that idea of universal peace,
Hmm.
which I feel like, aside from the war between Earth and Mars in Terrorhawks, there's no real sense of a wider galaxy, or at least it's not really discussed at all in the show. So it, it's just they're different. They are just different shows. So I think anyone who has maybe thought, you know, don't bother with Starfleet. It is a different. It's a different beast. It's just it is different. And as you
Yeah.
say, like it was not directly connected to any of the kind of Terrorhawks, Thunderbirds 2086, Thunderhawks
No.
stuff that was happening
No.
at the same time. So that's really interesting. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's how that kind of
There
came
was
about.
just that kind of that it was just in the wind. I think there
Yeah.
was a sense, and you know, I mean, by this time, the Muppet Show had become a top-rated thing.
Mm.
Jim Henson was working on The Dark Crystal, which also came out in 1982. So, you know, there was just a general groundswell. And I mean, Yoda, for crying out loud, had
Yeah.
just kind of emerged and kind
Yeah.
of proved that you could have a convincing fantasy character created with a puppet. And so
Yeah.
that, you know, where are you going to go from there? Who are you going to go to? Well, the only person who'd really done that successfully was Gerry Anderson. So,
That is, and the funny thing with Gerry Anderson, of course, is the fact that he himself was not directly connected with the craft of puppetry. It was
right.
obviously something that he produced and made all these shows, but he himself was not getting hands on picking up puppets. And
No, no.
whenever I see Jerry described as a puppet master, I'm like,
Yes.
well, that's technically
That's,
not quite true
that's
because
one way of looking at it. Yeah, but
I
not really.
cannot imagine him actually operating a puppet. So it's like,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. It's
I
hard
feel
to
like,
picture.
yeah, I don't think he, at least in his lifetime, necessarily ever quite got that charm and that I don't know what was possible with puppets. Feel like, yeah,
Hmm.
in the 80s there was a lot of people looking towards look at all these things that are possible with puppetry, whereas
Hmm.
Jerry had always been like, puppetry is so limiting. At
Yes,
least that's
very
the kind
much
of thing.
so.
So it's weird to have these two things moving in opposite directions in a way.
One of the interesting things that you bring up is Jerry's lack of interest in puppetry.
Yeah.
I think that was very much true for Jim Henson in the beginning too. He didn't
Oh,
set out to be a guy who was associated with puppetry. He did it as kind of a job, but
okay.
didn't really find it as a passion until he went to Europe and saw some of the puppet theater there.
I
So
did not know that.
yeah, it was
That's
just a
really
gig to him in the
interesting.
beginning, and a lot of puppeteers, in particular Carol Spinney, who did Big Bird, he
Right.
would say Jim was so rough with the puppets. He treated them like they were objects instead of characters.
That's fascinating. Gosh,
Yeah,
you see,
so
I always did think of him as like, oh, okay, he's a true kind of puppet
master.
enthusiast there. So
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I think he became that eventually, but it
Okay.
definitely didn't start out that way. So it's
Yeah.
everyone who's ever been a great puppet master did not seek out
That's
being a great puppet
fascinating.
master.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
That
Yeah.
happens to you.
Yeah. 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 As far as the Anderson connection is concerned, obviously one of the other elements of any Anderson show that we have to talk about is special effects, and
Yes.
Starfleet also has its fair share of models and explosions and action sequences and that kind of thing. Which again, for me at least, they just have a different energy. There's a kind of they really pack a punch actually.
They
what
do.
what's interesting is that just the way that the miniatures are shot just
Mm.
feels very different. There's a kind of, as I say, there's in the same way that you can see when a puppet is running down a corridor that they are just being bolted down by, you can tell there's kind of someone underneath holding it. I feel like
Yes.
in the same way, you can feel the human element involved in making those miniatures kind of come to life. I wonder if you could talk a little bit on like how just the general feel of the special effects and how it maybe differs from some of the Anderson stuff that we're familiar with.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things about the Gerry Anderson stuff was there was a lot of, particularly the earlier stuff, I would say kind of Thunderbirds and back. You
Mm,
had, and well, maybe even up to Captain Scarlet and Joe 90, you had a lot of locked off camera shots. And
mm,
if you had a moving camera and a special effects shot, it was very carefully planned.
yeah.
It had a very like polished kind of feel to it,
Mm,
which is great because the focus is on the special effects, not on the camera movement.
right.
But
Yeah.
in Starfleet, and indeed in a lot of tokusatsu, which is like this subgenre of
Okay.
Japanese special effects film. So things like Godzilla,
Right.
that kind of stuff, or Ultraman would be a big one.
Okay.
You have a lot of whip zooms, a lot of
Yes.
it's not necessarily handheld, although there are some shots that look handheld.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, there's an energy of like okay, the operator's moving the camera and tracking with stuff,
Exactly.
which is
Yes.
it adds a lot of energy to some shots that are less than convincing. So
Yeah.
even when I find a special effects shot doesn't work for me as a viewer.
Right.
So for example, they're in space. The show is set in space, but the gravity technique that Brian Johnson perfected in Space 1999, where he
Mm.
blows up an eagle and he shoots it from underneath so that the pieces
Everything
disperse
spreads. Yeah.
in an accurate way. There's none of that in
No.
Starfleet. It literally is just like they put a firecracker inside a model and they blow it up in front of a
Yeah.
backing, and that's the
Yes.
shot.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a
But
lot of like when the destruction is going on, it kind of goes back to I've often said about Fireball XL5 that the practical effects, feel very out of control in a way, which yes, there are big bangs, but because they're not being filmed in a controlled manner, they don't
yes,
come across well on screen. And I feel like Starfleet has that kind of a little bit as well. It's sort of like, well, we're going to
yeah,
blow this up, and we don't know how big the bang is going to be, but it'll hopefully look good on camera.
yeah.
Um,
That's a
they
great comparison. I never thought of it that
they
way before.
mostly get away with it actually in this, but
They do.
yeah, there are definitely moments where you can feel like this is a special effect rather, and it just removes you from the story a little bit. Um,
Sure.
but yeah, I love like that very first shot of the series with the planet, that shows all the planets. The way the camera moves around that space is
Magnificent.
like, I mean, it's great because you can't actually figure out in a way sort of where the set starts, and it just feels like this kind of big massive space, which in Anderson shows, because the camera for a lot of the effect shots is like static. You know
Mhm.
that in a way you're looking at a set, you're looking at a base and a sky backdrop and something happening in the middle of it. Whereas
Sure.
because the camera moves around so much in Starfleet, you often kind of do just get that. It's a little bit more immersive in a way,
It is.
just
Yeah.
because there's kind of a bit more going on. It's a bit more dynamic.
Yeah.
Yes, everything kind of moves
That's not to
around.
take anything away from what Derek Meddings and the
Oh,
team are
of
doing, because they
course, yeah,
definitely there's a thing about like using low angles in special effects
yeah,
and keeping things at ground level so you have kind of a sense of where you are and the scale things are supposed to be.
yeah,
Starfleet disregards that kind of
yeah,
stuff. So,
yeah,
it's very much apples and oranges in
yeah.
terms of approach to how
Yeah.
you want to tell
Well,
a
and
story.
again, it kind of just goes back to the overall style, which was very grounded in realism for Anderson stuff. They wanted it to look as realistic as possible, whereas Starfleet, it was more about conveying a certain kind of as mythical feeling to it, where things aren't quite for real necessarily. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of interesting that that kind of carried across. But just thinking about some of the models,
Mm.
like you can kind of get a sense that, like, certainly the Imperial Alliance battle cruiser
Hmm.
and X Bomber itself as well were huge, really
Huge
well
models. Yeah.
detailed. I mean, do you know roughly kind of what we're talking about here in terms of size of some of those
Yeah.
models?
So I'm thinking. I want to say that the hero Imperial Alliance battle cruiser model, and I have a photograph of it here somewhere,
Right.
was about 2 meters
Wow.
long. So it was quite. It took 4 or 5 people to move this thing. It was quite
That's
giant.
wild.
And the X Bomber one would have been similar,
Okay.
um, quite large
Yeah.
models that they were using.
That is
But
stunning. That I mean, that must have been so cumbersome to work with.
oh yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously they had models in different scales. So in
Yeah.
the very first episode, you see um, the Imperial Alliance cruiser from a distance as the
Mm.
EDF ship flies past. What is
Hmm.
that? That's a much smaller miniature than the one that they use in that opening shot
Okay.
that you're talking about, where it flies over and it's kind of
Yeah.
the Star Wars Imperial this
Mm.
Star Destroyer moment.
Yes.
That would
Yeah.
have been, a very different scale miniature.
Absolutely.
But yeah, the miniatures were quite big and quite detailed.
Yeah.
Very lovely, very
Yeah.
lovely miniatures.
Does any of that stuff survive? I feel like it
Ah,
maybe doesn't, but maybe does. Oh, there was. I'm gonna let you tell this story because I'm not entirely 100% on it. But yeah, what happened to all of
well, I'll show you
that
here.
stuff?
This book in my hands is the an exhibition catalog for a
Ah,
2022 exhibition that took place in Tokyo
right.
about X Bomber.
Okay.
So, but I'll show you here. So this is kind of the interesting part of Starfleet, the Starfleet story, and what kind of drew me into it. I've always been interested in Starfleet and wanted to contribute to the fandom in some way. And this was kind of the thing that drew me back into creating a blog and writing about it. So when Starfleet came out in Japan, it was nothing special, fell dead. When it came to the UK, it was actually a massive hit. It did really, really well in the UK. And there was a comic tie-in drawn by Mike Noble in Look In magazine. There was the Brian May
Hmm.
connection. So all this stuff is happening, and Louis Ellman and all his cohort, all the people at ITV are like, we have to get more of this show. Like this is a massive hit. We have to do more with it. And so what they did was they phoned Japan and said we'd like to order another show. Like tell us how much it's going to cost, and we'll make it happen because it's huge here. And they were told at the time that there had been a warehouse fire and everything was destroyed. So
Wow.
no more puppets, no more models. That's the end of it.
Yeah.
Sayonara.
Right.
And that was, as far as anyone in the West knew, that was the whole story.
Okay.
Well, circa 2022, when this exhibition happened, uh, there's a wonderful artist, Max Watanabe, I believe is his name, who basically spent 20 years creating reproductions, loving, careful,
Ah.
beautiful reproductions of puppets and models and things.
Right.
But as you start to dig into the exhibition and look at, you see in the captions, which are in English and Japanese, in case anyone wants to get this book, um, you see a lot of these are original. A lot of them are the original sculpts of the puppets. Like pretty much all the original sculpts that the puppets were molded from still exist. And quite a few puppets themselves still exist in models as well. And so you're wondering, well, as you read about it, you're like, oh, there definitely was a fire. But
Right.
how big was the fire?
Hmm.
These details are kind of missing. And
Hmm.
the
That's really
story
interesting.
in the West was that all this stuff was gone, right?
Hmm.
Everything was gone. And now, lo and behold, 40 years later, it
It
starts to
it
reemerge.
turns up. That's interesting. I wonder
Yeah,
whether maybe because thinking about there was a gap of some years between it being made in Japan, failing in
yeah,
Japan, and then being made in the UK, and then being shown in the UK and being really
right.
popular. Whether maybe it was more of a we're kind of done with this
Right. I wonder that
anyway.
too.
So
Yeah. If they
yeah,
were like, we just can't be arsed to
yeah,
dig all
maybe
this
it was
stuff
like
out.
there was a fire, so it's just kind of like
Right.
we've drawn the line under that. Whether stuff survives or not, we're just
Yeah.
kind of done. That's very
Or
interesting that
possibly
that's the way it went.
possibly that they didn't even know. Like
Right,
people didn't even know what survived and what didn't.
right. So
So,
maybe
and
stuff went into storage and just kind of,
yeah,
was stored in an entirely separate place, maybe. And yeah, I mean, there's all
there's
sorts
a
of
thing that
stuff.
I'm learning as I get deeper into the Anderson world is that a lot of the stuff that was supposedly just thrown into the trash at
Yeah.
the end of the shows was actually a lot of it was taken home by people.
Oh
People
yeah.
just took home souvenirs,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I suspect that's how we wound up with a lot of this stuff.
I think so.
A
Yeah,
lot of
that
people,
sounds
like
about
for
right.
example, the Imperial Master puppet survived pretty much in its entirety
Wow.
because somebody grabbed it and took it home at the end of the shoot.
Okay. Now,
So,
this actually brings me on to something that is it's so the Imperial Master,
mm,
that's a person in a costume, right?
yes. Uh-huh.
Or to an extent. And the same
Yes,
with
to an extent. I'm not sure exactly how much.
okay, and the same with like certain shots of Diex are
Yes.
obviously
Yes.
someone in a
Yes.
costume.
Yes.
That to me is just like I don't know. Again, as someone very used to Supermarionation, which yes, use live action, hand inserts, but you're
Yeah.
used to a certain way that the characters move, and you just kind of expect
Yes.
to suddenly see something that you go from a very stiff puppet, as we already talked about with the Starfleet puppets, and
Yeah.
then to suddenly see something that moves like a person, that is a
Hmm.
person in a costume,
Right.
it is really it's jarring, but like not in a terrible way or anything. It's
Right.
just again, it's that kind of there's an energy behind Starfleet, which watching it for the first time, I was like, anything could happen. They
Yes.
really just tried whatever to get the desired effect on screen. And
Oh
that's
yeah.
kind of exciting to me at a time where obviously I've watched the Supermarionation stuff over and over and over again. I know how it
Yeah.
plays out.
You
There's
know
a
the
certain
rules.
that exactly there are certain rules to the way that Supermarionation shows are made and
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
never ever broken because it's like this is how we do it. If we try and break those rules, you end up with the investigator, and we don't
Right.
need to go into that.
That's another
But
stream.
that's a whole other thing. But Starfleet is like just like there are no rules. They
Yeah.
will do whatever's needed, and that's why you get results in some spectacular shots. Like,
Yeah.
I'm constantly reminded because I've seen the first episode so many times. That shot when they arrive on Moonbase, where they're coming down the
Mm.
escalators. It's just like a massive set, and I'm also thinking about inside of the Earth defense base. You
Huge
see
set.
shots of like,
Yeah.
huge set, lots of layers of puppets, and then also
Yeah.
miniature character, which I assume are only a
Yeah.
few
There's a
inches
bit of
tall.
forced perspective going on
Bit of
there too,
forced
which is really
perspective, and
impressive.
although you can tell it's forced perspective, obviously there is
Mhm.
still kind of an excitement there, just
Yeah.
in these shots are just being thrown together with whatever, like just whatever to try and make it work, and that in a way
Yeah.
is exciting. And again, it kind of I think switches that attitude of like anything can be done with puppets rather
Oh
than
yeah.
oh
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
puppets are extremely limited, we can only do these things with them. It's like no, we can do anything with them and
Yeah.
we will just make it work, and sometimes it pays off, and it just depends again how well your brain is kind of trained to just
Yes.
accept certain things as part of the story. So yeah, that was definitely one of the things that I took away from kind of my
Yeah.
first watch through. Are there anything and
Most puppeteers work in theater. It's kind of a
right?
normal thing. And one of the reasons why I don't work in theater, why I work in film, is
Mm,
because of seeing things like Starfleet, where the cinematography and the method of making the film actually becomes part of the puppetry.
right,
It's the whole thing
definitely.
is a whole where they're shooting these dynamic shots and they've got these special effects. It's all one art form that fits
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, and I imagine like each shot is kind of a new problem to be solved. And if you're the kind of person who likes a challenge and likes to solve problems, then that's gonna be quite appealing in a way
Yes.
that yes, maybe. Although theater puppetry definitely has its own
Oh, for sure.
challenges and things like that, and people do
Yeah.
some fantastic kind of revolutionary stuff with that as well. But I can see how, yeah, in filmmaking that is just kind of magnified because every detail is up for examination, like right
Yeah.
there. So it all has to be exact, and also because you have the time to
Right.
finesse it. Well, if you're lucky, you have the time to finesse
Yes.
it anyway.
If you're
Um,
lucky enough to even be able to do it.
yeah, exactly. So one of the other aspects of Starfleet that I find very unique, and I've talked about it before, is the kind of storytelling, the
Yes.
way the serialized kind of one episode goes straight into the next, and we're left with these cliffhangers at the end of each one.
It's got a
Totally
story
different,
arc.
totally different from Anderson stuff, which is episodic, it resets at the end, and
Yep.
there's very little of a story arc that goes all the way through.
Hmm.
Which, as I say, when I first kind of came into it, I wasn't expecting that, and that's why I kind
Oh.
of didn't get into the rhythm of what tuning back in. If you
Hmm.
see, like, I'm very used to the Super Nation shows to just be able to put them down, watch a few episodes, put it down again, and not lose anything in that experience of watching it. Whereas with Starfleet, that because it's a continuous story, you want to stay in. I guess it maybe just took me a little while to get invested in it and kind of learn that method of storytelling. But how do you, is there a way that you kind of prefer, or how does the kind of overall story arc of Starfleet kind of come across to you? Is it something that you are kind of very invested in?
Hmm. Well, I was very I mean it I like to say that the greatest strength of Starfleet is its serial storytelling because
Okay.
it takes these very kind of they read as if you just watch the first episode, which is what a lot of people like I think on the Benji and Nick show they did this. They watched the first episode and they said,
Uh,
"Oh, what is this?" And it's like you don't realize that the arc builds as it goes
yeah,
and
it really does.
characters become really they seem flat and two-dimensional in the first episode, but
Yes,
they pick up momentum as they
they
go.
do.
And
Yes.
by the
Yeah.
time you get to the deaths of certain characters and really
Right.
heavy moments and things like confronting a mentor figure
Yeah.
who's gone to the dark side, so to speak. I mean,
Yeah.
stuff that's way richer than you can do character wise in a standalone story, but
Right.
way richer than anything you could have dared in a 30-minute Saturday morning TV show any
Yeah.
other way. So I'm very much a fan of the approach. However, I do think that I mean it's pretty much what's cost Starfleet its reputation.
Mm,
It's people like I was just saying, they see the first episode and that's all they see
yeah.
because it's you have to if you're going to do that you have to open strong to hook people and get
Right.
them
It
interested and
is a
keep them
kind of
going.
slow burn. It takes a few episodes to certainly get to
Yeah.
what is actually kind of the heart of the show, which is
Yeah.
the quest for F-01, and you know,
Yeah, which
just
doesn't really
figuring out
start
what's
until
going
episode
on.
6.
Doesn't start until later in the show, and then
Yeah.
yeah, the as you've mentioned, the death of certain characters have a huge impact in on what happens later. But because
Mm.
again, that stuff doesn't come up until later on. If you don't stick around past the first few episodes, there's a huge amount you miss out on.
Yeah.
Whereas, again, going back to Anderson shows, the first episode of at least the most successful Anderson shows pack everything into the first episode. You know
Yes, which
exactly
is
what you're
the right
getting every
choice, I
week,
think.
which is the
Yeah.
way if you're certainly if you're selling a popular TV show, that's the
Yeah.
way to do it. Whereas, you know, Starfleet, yes, it takes a while. In fact, really, until you get to the final episode, you don't really get a full sense of what it was really kind of going for the whole time.
Yeah.
Um, which is
Which does make
great.
it richer to rewatch,
Right,
as you'll find if you rewatch it.
now that I
That
have
you'll
finally
see
kind of
meanings that you didn't see before.
exactly now I have finally kind of watched through the whole series, I can now view it as kind of a whole piece and
Right.
see it as like, yeah, okay, now I get it. Now I know what they were doing with it. So basically, what I'm
Mm,
saying is if you've never watched Starfleet, you have to watch the whole show.
yeah.
Although I
That's
will say in the first episode, you do get obviously a sense of, the atmosphere and the types of
yeah.
characters you're going to be interacting with, certainly. But
Yeah.
what I'm saying is it builds on that.
Yeah. It doesn't just
rather
stay
than
in one
rather than
place.
saying, right, this is the show, this is what it is, that's it. Which is what I found really interesting about the fact that you said like it doesn't work as a kind of feature film compilation.
Yeah.
I
I
find
think
that fascinating because
there is a feature film in there somewhere, and that's one of
right,
my like bucket list projects is to cut like a feature film version of Starfleet
yeah,
and kind of tell the whole story in a 2 hour chunk.
yeah,
Um,
because
but
I think
it's
you just
not.
about could, but
I think you definitely could, but
yeah,
not the way that they did on the US tapes.
yeah. Okay,
That
well,
was
fair
not the
enough.
way. And
Yeah,
I mean, like I say, it's not you can't get it by just watching the first episode. And you also can't really get it by binging the show, I don't think,
right.
because I think that experience would be frustrating. You kind of
Yeah,
have to watch it the way that it was originally intended
I
to be
will
watched,
say,
which was
like,
a
yeah,
Saturday morning.
I sort of tried. I binged it kind of this time round and just kind of
Mm,
went through it, and there was definitely a point, sort of somewhere in the middle, where I just sort of my attention was maybe elsewhere. But
yeah.
when I came back to it at the end,
Mm,
it recapped everything kind of enough to. But like you say, I think there is potential for it to be cut down to like a feature film sort of length, just
yeah.
because there is a bit of we talked about the fact that there are quite a few clip shows in this, which is kind of unusual. That took me by surprise. Was like, okay, suddenly we're having a clip show sort of halfway
Yes.
through an episode or something. It kind of
Yes.
felt like they just dropped stuff in to just fill time,
Yeah.
which doesn't obviously hasn't kind of aged very well.
No.
That type of storytelling, but it also kind of reinforces that Japanese folklore type feel of like,
Yeah.
yes, let's sit down and reflect on what's happened so far, and
Mhm.
let's think about the lessons we can learn from that. Whereas in an Anderson clip show, that's not really the approach at all. They're just chatting.
Yes.
Whereas in this, there's kind of a real gravity whenever
Yes.
characters are reflecting on things that have happened. Like when a character dies,
Mm,
that is a big deal. Like that really affects the characters in a big way, and
absolutely.
there is a real strong pathos to it, and it just
Hmm.
it's like it feels like a big moment. And I guess because you don't get to those big moments until slightly later on,
Hmm.
it's not there to
You miss
start with.
those.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
you really do just need to
Yeah.
keep
There,
watching, keep watching.
stick with it. It gets better.
Yeah.
There's kind of a thing in Japanese cinema in general with like you look at the grand masters of Japanese cinema, people like Yasujiro Ozu and Akira Kurosawa. Their films are all very kind of meditative.
Mm,
There's like a quality of gravitas about it, and I think that's very much true in Starfleet, where I mean, if something happens once, it happens 3 times
right.
almost, where it's and it not
I mean,
not necessarily in a
literally, in some cases, I'm thinking of
literally in
the
some
one
cases.
particular death scene where it's
It,
shot in such a way that it's like you will pay attention to this specific movement
yes,
that happens,
yes. And
which is
Paul
wonderful.
Bliss's score, we haven't talked about the music yet, but Paul
Oh boy,
Bliss's score really helps sell that for a Western audience, I
yeah,
think,
yeah,
where it becomes, it could be in certain anime you see things like that and it's cheesy. And I
yeah,
think in Starfleet, because of the music that they chose to go with Paul Bliss,
yeah.
really, really gives that gravitas
So
instead of being a cheap anime trick.
the music is origin. It was done for the dub right? So it's not the
Yes.
original Japanese music.
No, the
It's
original Japanese music is quite different. And so is if you listen to other versions, there's a French version as well that's
oh, right.
quite poppy and cheerful. And then the Japanese one is kind of it's done by a heavy metal band called Bow Wow, who are kind of the Japanese Led Zeppelin in a way.
Okay.
And it's quite it's its own thing. I don't there's nothing to compare it
There's
to.
nothing to describe it.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's I
fair
mean
enough.
it's a rock band, but it
Right.
they do something kind of martial and it's almost goofy in a way to
Okay.
me. But
Yeah.
again, that's a cultural thing.
But in the UK, yeah, Paul Bliss's soundtrack is really excellent and very memorable and very yeah, just hits all right. I'm not a musical person, so I find it very difficult to describe how music makes me feel, but it's like it does, it just hits it just right. And
Yeah.
yes, the gravity of certain situations is very much conveyed through that.
And he uses
Um
a lot of motifs, which kind of
right.
harkens back to Barry Gray and what he did
Yes.
for the Anderson
Yes.
shows, where
It
there's
is very
things that
much it is a proper soundtrack, if you see what I mean. Like it is very well put together. Despite that, so am I right? I feel like I've heard that Paul Bliss had not composed for film before.
no, this is his very first
That's
attempt.
amazing because he nails it.
Incredible.
It's absolutely, yeah, amazing.
Incredible talent.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so we talked a lot about like how people should try and stick with the first episode, try and stick with the series and everything. But is there anything else that you would want to say to people coming to Starfleet for the first time, maybe haven't seen it, might have kind of
Mm.
tangentially kind of heard of it because it's sort of like an Anderson show, but not what how would you advise people to kind of get into it?
Hmm.
Which is a complicated question, I realize, but I
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
like it's important because so many people I just feel like have never are aware of it but haven't actually taken the time to sit down and watch it. So
Yeah.
what do you think people can really expect from the show that is both familiar as an Anderson fan but different as well?
Yeah. Um I think, well, I mean, definitely the differences are obvious, and I think it's really interesting. If you're a fan of the Anderson stuff, it's great to be able to kind of compare and contrast the two
Mm.
and really, really dig into the compare and contrast and not just brush it off as, well, this is different. I don't like it. If that's your attitude, you're never going to get through it. But I think once you do commit to that, uh, and kind of starting with the comparison, but then as you study it, I think you'll find things. So there's kind of two aspects to enjoying these shows. They work on two levels, and this is true of all of these shows that we're talking about. That you can kind of appreciate it on a technical level, where you can go through as you've done and take screenshots and pay careful attention to the technical aspects of what they're doing, and that's one level of enjoyment. Or you can just like forget about all that and just enjoy the story. And I think Starfleet works on both of those levels as well.
Right.
I think you can really dig into the story. Um, Perhaps on the story level, you have to have a bit of a sense of humor and a bit of a filter to kind of translate some of the
Yeah.
awkwardness of the dialogue,
Mm.
which isn't true for every character, but
Yeah. I'm
certain
thinking
characterization.
Shiro in
Spyro's a
particular.
difficult one.
Some of his dialogue is a little clunky.
Yes.
But
Let's use the
if you can
super cannon.
but if you can
My favorite
work
one.
through that,
Yes.
you obviously have beautiful. I mean, we haven't really talked about the performances too much, but obviously the
No, but there are
highlight for
some
a lot
great
of
ones.
Anderson fans is going to be Denise Breyer as Commander
Oh,
Makara. It
oh,
is superb, superb.
I love Commander Makara more than Zelda because
Yeah,
she's sort of like what Zelda would have been like in her younger years. She's
yeah,
a bloodthirsty, harder edged, nastier
yes,
Zelda.
yes,
She's really
absolutely.
really got an edge to her, and
Yeah.
she's meant to be, I think, quite sexy as well, which is an
Mm.
unusual direction to go.
Sort of
And
in a Serverland Blake Seven sort of way.
Yeah,
I kind
kind
of
of.
get that maybe that might have been something they were going for, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, I totally see that. Yeah, there are some wonderful characters in this show, like
Yes.
Dr. Ben. There's a lot of kind of substitute father figures in this
Yes.
show. And again, it's one of the themes that kind of carries through the whole thing of like respecting elders and like mentorship
Yes.
and the pecking order and that kind of thing.
Mm.
It comes up again and again and again, but it's not necessarily there to start with. It's something that grows and nurtures over the course of the whole show.
Yeah.
So it's one of the reasons to kind of stick through it and see how that develops and see how various characters, relationships with their mentors and things like that change and
Yes.
become significant. So yeah, that's just something but yeah, Dr. Ben beautifully performed as well. Um, Barry Hercules, John Lee. I mean, they're all really, really good characters that just stick out as like I don't know, like that. And again, that there's a uniformity to most Super Mario Nation characters, but for the puppets in Starfleet,
Mm.
they're all different shapes and sizes. It's just about whatever was needed to kind of get across that character, which kind of makes it really
Yeah.
bold and like clear and memorable. Which I really enjoy about it as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And the dub, the UK dub serves those caricatures that are on the screen as
Yes.
well. So it's a
Yes.
perfect kind of blend. I think aside from the fact that some of the dubbing, like the timing of fitting lines into the puppets' mouths,
Yeah.
it, if it weren't for that element, you would think that it was always kind of a British
Meant to
show,
be that
just in
way.
terms of the way the characters are portrayed. Like the
Yeah.
dub does such a good job of creating these characters. It isn't just
Hmm.
about let's translate the dialogue. It's like, no, let's give these characters a performance that
Yeah.
is true to what's on screen.
Yeah.
It really
It
is very,
really
very
it
good
really
in
is
that
a
regard.
technical note more than it is a performance note. I think the performances are pretty much spot on. It's
Mm,
really just a technical problem that they
yeah,
never quite landed. I suspect because they just did not have time.
right, right.
That's really all there is to it. But
Yeah.
yeah, as you say, I mean, a wonderful, wonderful group of characters. Captain Orion is a great one who has
Oh,
fantastic arc
goodness,
over the
yes.
whole series.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lamia is one who she's kind of an interesting one because she can be kind of up and down where there's some weeks where
Yeah.
you're like, oh, this is really really tough, and then other weeks where you kind of, especially watching it for the second time, as you go through, you start to see, oh wow, they're doing something really interesting with her where she's
Yeah.
transforming.
And again, it's slow. It's a slow build up. It's not something you just kind of hit with. It
No, no,
it's very subtle, and yeah, you reach the end of the series, and you're like, well, of course, that was the direction she was always going in.
yeah,
But
subtlety,
as you're
that
watching it,
famous,
yeah,
the subtlety, the famous element of children's television. You know,
exactly,
I
exactly.
like my Saturday morning cereal with a bit of subtlety, please. But it
Yes,
works. It
yeah,
works
it
well.
really does. It really does. So, Starfleet fandom, how does that manifest? How is it different from kind of Gerry Anderson? Is there a crossover between the fandoms? I know nothing about it really, so
Yeah,
I'd be interested to hear kind of what your take on it is. I know you've mentioned like there are websites and things like that,
yeah.
but yeah, what have fans kind of contributed to the legacy of the show?
Oh my goodness. Well, the fans are the legacy of Starfleet
Okay,
as far as the Western uh, audience is concerned.
right,
Um, so yeah, it's a really a mixed crowd. You have people who grew up watching it when it was on TV in the 80s. You have people like myself who discovered it later. You have people who are anime fans. You have people who are Anderson fans. It's not a large group of people who are dedicated Starfleet fans, but we all know each other. It's a pretty, you know, tight knit
that's
and
great.
very friendly community of
Hmm.
people who've been hanging out in the SFXB forums for years.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have a great website called xbomber.co.uk,
Hmm.
which is run by Piers Bell, who's just an amazing guy. He runs monthly fan Skypes where people just come and hang out and talk about Starfleet
All
and
right.
other related sci-fi nonsense.
Yeah.
And he's created an X Bomber video game, which you can download. It's
What?
kind of an arcade style adventure.
That's
It's,
amazing.
it's a brilliant thing. He's been working on it for years, and there's
Uh-huh.
lots of different versions of it. And
Wow.
he also kind of has the archive portion on xbomber.co.uk, which if there's anything you want to know about X Bomber, it's all there.
Oh,
He's done a
goodness.
really amazing job. We have
Yeah.
a great, well, a couple people actually, but the one I'm thinking of is the guy named Gary Cass, who's a 3D modeler, CAD artist, and a 3D printer who
Mm.
makes amazing 3D printed models of X
Wow.
Bomber and various craft and characters. So it's all it's a really committed fandom, and it's a
Yeah.
fandom that wants to contribute something. So
Okay.
there's fan fiction about what happens after the series ends to kind of continue the story.
Mm-hmm.
Starfleet Genesis being one that I made an audio drama of when I was 14 years old.
Wow.
So that happened.
Okay.
My very very niche claim to fame.
Nice.
Uh,
Wow.
yeah, so it's a very like it's a
It's a
great
very
fandom.
productive fandom. Sounds of
Yeah,
it. Everyone's making stuff. Everyone's working. So
everyone's making stuff.
that's
There's a lot of
fantastic.
fan art, which if you follow,
Yeah.
there's quite a few Facebook pages. Starfleet X Bomber movie
Mm-hmm.
is one group. There's a couple pages as well that are worth
Yeah.
following just to see the fan art that they share.
Yeah.
Some really great Commander Makara in particular. His character people love to draw, and it's always great.
Amazing. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, that's really wonderful that continues and
Yeah,
that it's still going strong. It hasn't sort of died out or anything like that. It
no,
sounds like there is a lot of enthusiasm still there for,
yeah,
a 24 episode show. It,
yeah,
could have had a very limited lifespan, but it sounds like
could
people
have, but
have
it definitely
turned around
continues
and
to,
seen the potential for more in there. Like the
yeah,
fact that people have written continuations and things like that is very encouraging, and I love that
yeah.
that exists. Now,
There's a lot of positivity and energy in the group, and
definitely. Now, we have to talk about your blog, which is kind of how
yes,
you are contributing to the ongoing legacy of Starfleet.
pluggy
What
plug.
what on earth are you getting up to over at let me get the web address correct. It is starfleetxbomber.substack.com for
That is
Ben's
it.
Starfleet blog. What
Yes.
what are you doing over there?
What kind of nonsense am I cooking up this time, Jack? So I started this thing called X Blogger. Um, as I said earlier, kind of intrigued by the rediscovery of the puppets and the restorations that were on display in 2022.
Hmm.
And kind of realized that there hadn't been an episode guide in quite some time. Episode guides, a lot of the older websites, Big X and F01, that have gone offline, and they had great
Hmm.
episode guides. And Andy's sfxb.co.uk has a great episode guide that's still up, but it's the images are a little lower res, and
Hmm.
it kind of just recaps the story for people who maybe haven't seen the show. There hadn't been kind of like a detailed analysis kind of episode guide where somebody kind of like what you did with Security Hazard was a big inspiration. uh, so seeing how you like went in detail through
Right.
Thunderbirds, I was like, ooh. And I kind of rewatch Starfleet every other year about
Okay.
anyway, just for the
Yeah.
love of it.
Yeah.
It's like, what if I rewatch it again and blog my way through it the way that
Yeah.
Jack does? And I launched into this project thinking, oh, it's couldn't be that hard, and it's quite time consuming, as you know.
I do know, but I do think it's fantastic that
It's so much fun.
that you're able to do that because yeah, certainly one of the reasons why I've done my blog posts about Thunderbirds and Stingray in the way that I have is because I want to kind of learn something from the show just by watching it. There is
Yeah,
actually so much production stuff that is hidden away in plain sight. Uh,
yeah.
it's like if you just watch the show slowly and take in every frame, every little detail of it,
Mhm.
you get so much from it. Um, and I mean, that's exactly the approach you've taken with Starfleet. And it takes it takes enthusiasm for it. Like people are always asking me, which Anderson show are you going to cover next? And I'm like, well, there's only certain ones that I feel I could actually write on with some confidence. But so you really have to love it
Yes.
in order to do it, which people do find difficult to believe sometimes when you're picking it apart.
Sure.
But it comes from a place of love, of just wanting to find out more and wanting to
Yeah.
explore it. So I mean, that's definitely the approach that you've taken. I enjoy just the freedom you have to just kind of go through the episodes, just at a gentle pace. I will say, like as you say, it's a time consuming, slow process
Sure.
to go through all of it, but it
Yeah.
feels kind of important to do it that way. So I love the way that you tackle that in the same sort of way. And yeah, I'm all for it. Like you know, it's important that this stuff happens because there's not always going to be that information available. So
Sure.
it's good for people like yourself to go and sit down. And as I say, I know very little about Starfleet. I've watched it, but I don't have that kind of ingrained encyclopedic knowledge that is really needed.
I
So
don't
I'm
know if I
glad
do
that you,
either. I'm very fortunate. Like as I say, it's great to have such an awesome fan community
yeah,
because I would be absolutely lost without
yeah,
Piers and his website and Andy and his support. I
yeah.
mean, these guys, if I guys and gals, but if I ever need something, it's always online for me to
That's
find.
great. Yeah.
So
Well, and
it's
it's important sometimes you tie those connections together. You see what one person has
absolutely
said about it, you see what another person said about it, and you go, but if you look at this thing in the show, then that joins up with that, and yeah, you just
yeah, you
start to
build
see these things
connections.
happen. And yeah, it takes time, but and it is a collaborative effort. Like you do need yeah, insight from other people. I would be
Absolutely.
I always this is something I started doing with Stingray at least, was I
Hmm.
always kind of reference my sources for that kind of stuff, because it's like
Yeah,
you 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 need to like know like where bits and pieces are kind of coming from to kind of
yeah.
make certain claims about the show. So yeah,
There's a lot of things in fandom generally, but in these things specifically that are kind of like rumors that have built
yeah,
up over time and fan beliefs that well, when you start to examine them, you start to find.
yeah,
So a great example of this is I've just done a kind of a beginner's guide to the Starfleet project by Brian May.
right.
And one of the things that I discovered was that his son, who in some versions of the story, his son not only came up with the idea uh, to watch Starfleet, but also came up with the idea to record the album.
Mm.
He was like, "Oh, Daddy, you should go record this song," and it's like, "Oh, that's actually a good idea." But his son was only 4 years old when the album was
Ah.
recorded, so when you start to do the detective work and you're like, "Oh, wait a minute," like I wonder how much of this was like Brian bringing his son into it and then his son got hooked, or like
Okay.
so when you know these things, it gives you a little
Yeah,
bit more
there's just
context.
certain nuances to those stories
Yeah,
and it's exactly the same with Anderson stuff. Like when you actually sit down and think about it, you actually sit down and look at the shows and going, oh, maybe that story isn't quite being told in the right way, or
sure.
something about it.
Or
So
there's a different
yeah,
perspective that gives you a new insight into what because people, even if they're not lying, people have different
oh, of course.
perspectives. And so that's a key part of it, I think, is
Yeah,
hearing all the
yeah,
different
exactly. Those
perspectives.
perspectives are very important. Yes, absolutely. Well, anyway, So if you want to learn more about Starfleet, if you are going to start watching the show, which you absolutely should, and you want someone to watch it with you, teach you a little bit about it, Ben is here. Go to
Hi.
starfleetexbomber.substack.com.
It's okay. I'm
It's
here.
right there. So, so that's just one of the things you worked on. As you mentioned, you're a
Oh yeah.
filmmaker, you're a puppeteer. Um, Astral Beacon.
Yeah, let's talk about Astral
Let's
Beacon.
talk Astral Beacon. So, what is it?
That's a whole nother podcast. So
Yeah.
Astral Beacon is my debut feature film that
Uh,
I am hard at work on actively right now. It is the story of a deep space lighthouse keeper. So it's a lighthouse in the middle of an asteroid
mhm.
field. So and it's about the lighthouse keeper whose daughter has died, and he's kind of retreated to this lighthouse to kind of study the case and see if he can figure out who killed her. And the guy that he thinks did it actually ends up crashing in the asteroid field. He has to decide what to do about this. He finds out they're being pursued by bounty hunters, and mayhem ensues. So, Astral Beacon, it's a movie that I'm working on. Been working on since the pandemic. It started off actually pre-pandemic. It started off as kind of being a movie in a year project, and
Mm.
I was like, I'm just gonna make a movie with cardboard and whatever. And then a casting director I know got involved, and a producer got involved, and it's just kind of grown into a real grown-up puppet movie,
Wow.
so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's
So,
been
puppet movie, obviously, we have to talk about
yes,
like what are the influences that have kind of come into that? You've mentioned already that sort of that European style of puppetry has kind of come into it, but
yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of like Anderson stuff and Starfleet and anything else, what have been the influences there that have dictated some of the decisions made around the
Sure.
puppetry?
Well, I mean, Starfleet definitely is a huge one. If only for the kind of, I think it's the most cinematic of the kind of Super Marination and Super Marination adjacent storytelling.
Mm,
But Thunderbirds also, I mean, what can you say about Thunderbirds? I mean, just such a huge impact.
mm,
But kind of also leaving all of that stuff behind in a way and saying, well, how far can we push this medium, and where can we go with it? I actually had one person approach me and say, uh, "You can't do this with puppets. Like this isn't possible." I said, "Well, you know,
like,
and you
please let me show you exactly what is
let me
possible.
show you what's possible." And so it's great to have forebearers, but it's also great, I think, to experiment.
Yeah.
And I think it seems in a weird way like it arrived at exactly the wrong time, because we were talking about groundswells. There was kind of one in 2015 where
Yeah.
there was Thunderbirds. The anniversary episodes were being made, and then the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance was made, and Firestorm was kind of happening
Hmm.
with Anderson Entertainment, and you had all this stuff happening that's kind of it's not like it's not happening, because I think there's still some Nebula 75 rumblings and various other things.
Yeah.
Meekshi is very
Hmm.
active, which is a wonderful show.
Oh
Everybody should
yes.
watch Meekshi. I love Meekshi.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
And
right now
funnily
that
enough, that kind of I feel like also Star Wars, of course.
sure,
They made a big deal with the new Star Wars
yes,
trilogy about practical
yes,
filmmaking kind of making a comeback. So I think that had an influence as well.
yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah, and that was definitely because the Mandalorian was already out when
mm,
I started working on Astral Beacon. So there was a moment there where it was kind of huge and coming back in a big way. And now the focus has shifted to AI.
mm,
AI generated content is kind of the topic of conversation right now. And at first I found this development kind of distressing, because it's like, oh, I've missed the moment. But then you kind of realize it's I think now more than ever people need connection, and
right.
that's kind of what puppetry provides in a way. It's a way of connecting with people,
Yeah.
and providing people with kind of a blank slate that they can. It's not for people. Puppetry is not for people who just want to passively enjoy things.
Right.
It's for engagement and connection.
That
So
makes
it's
sense. Yeah.
if you people who say, "Oh, puppets is stupid," they're not investing in it. They're not watching it. They're not engaging with it. They're just passively watching it and not
Right.
connecting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That
you have
connection is yeah, vital. And
yeah,
it
and
sounds
I
like,
think
I should just, just from you describing that story, like
sure.
there is a very human kind of story and connection that you want to
Oh,
make there.
absolutely.
And the fact that
Yeah.
you're telling it with puppets, I think will enhance that because you will be able to magnify certain qualities of it that you perhaps wouldn't be able to do if
Oh
you were
yeah.
filming it with live action, um, and take it to a more, again, we keep coming back to this kind of mythical thing
Yeah.
that
Well,
Starfleet has, but it
it
sounds like you kind of have a little bit of that going on
yeah.
with
Well,
Astral Beacon as well.
it to me this is kind of a strange soapbox on which only I reside. But puppetry is such a great symbol of determinism, where people use it as, oh, you're just a puppet. You're a puppet on a string, when they mean that somebody's locked into. But if you've ever done any kind of acting or performance, you know that characters exist outside of the thing. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like, and if you're performing with a puppet and you do something that's not true to the character, you feel it. It feels wrong.
hmm
And so there's kind of like a sense in which there's some determinism with puppetry, but also to me they're a great symbol of free will, and it's
Yeah.
kind of paradoxical in that way, where they're alive but they're not alive, and
Yeah.
it's that going back to like tricking your brain and your lizard brain and how it identifies what things are threats and what things are alive and what things are just objects that you don't have to worry about. So all of that plays into Astral Beacon and his questions about life and death, because he uses the crystal that powers the lighthouse to talk to his daughter,
Uh-huh.
but he doesn't know if he's really talking to his daughter, or what kind of spiritual or existential
Yeah.
things might be going on in that world. So it's very
That's
much influenced
beautiful. That
by
sounds fantastic.
mythology, free will, and the whole debate about whether or not we have it, or whether or not we're just puppets.
Right. Oh, that is
As those
magnificent.
are
So,
themes of Astral Beacon.
perfect. So, remind us again.
astralbeaconfilm.com.
Okay, and people can contribute and kind of get
Absolutely.
involved.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
Well,
a Substack for that too. You can subscribe to for updates. There's a
mhm.
Patreon. I'm on Ko-Fi, Buy Me a Coffee. All the ways that you support are
Yep.
all out there for you.
Yeah. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your I got what I wanted out of this, which is I feel educated, I feel smarter now.
Oh, great.
Not just about Starfleet, but about puppetry in general, about
Oh,
filmmaking in general and storytelling. It's always great to kind of get those insights from other people. It's just wonderful.
that's
So
great.
thank you very much for sharing that with us. You've already plugged a few things, but if you had like 3 places to send people, what would those be?
Besides the ones that I've already mentioned, or including them?
Including them or adding to them. I don't know.
Well,
You don't even have to stop at 3 if you don't want to. I'm just trying
okay,
to make it
great.
easy for you, but do tell.
Well, definitely check out astralbeaconfilm.com, because it's a very special project. Check out, if you're interested in Starfleet, starfleetxbomber.substack.com is where you go to find all the Starfleet things. You can follow me on Twitter at Cinemarionette. I'm pretty active on there, so you can see all the different things that I'm up to, including things that have nothing to do with any of this stuff that we haven't even talked about. Uh, my work with Anderson Entertainment, I've adapted some Stingray books for audio, which you can find over there. Operation Ice Cap, Monster from the Deep, some great Stingray adventures. They're on shop.gerryanderson.com.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you can find other stuff I've done and
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
Gerry
Am
Anderson
I
store
right in
too.
thinking that you put together on Redbubble some Starfleet swag? that
There
people can get
is some
hold of?
Starfleet swag on
Yeah.
Redbubble. It's all, you can find it all through the Starfleet X Bomber Substack.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. Of course, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel to get more updates from me. And of course, the Security Hazard blog, securityhazard.net. I'm posting on there
Essential
every
reading.
2 weeks, and you can go on there and read all of my reviews of Thunderbirds and Stingray and all of that kind of thing. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Security Hazard. Ben, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure, and everybody else, stay tuned for more of this type of thing in the future. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.
Thanks, Jack. Bye.